Hello, listeners. Welcome back to the channel Easy CS Learning. The topic of today's discussion is CSS Selectors. Now, these selectors are used to uniquely identify the HTML elements. Why this identification is required? It is required to apply a specific set of styling to only those elements and not to others. Right? So, in order to identify such elements, the attributes are used. Right? Or in other words, if I say the elements can be identified using their attributes. Two such attributes that are used to identify the element or distinguish the elements within the HTML document are ID and class. Right? There could be two paragraphs in a document. If you want to uniquely identify these documents, I can use ID attribute and designate a value to these in order to distinguish these two attributes. Say I say para 1, para 2 are the identifiers using which two paragraphs are uniquely identified. Right? Similarly, class can also be used to have a combination of attributes such as, say, for example, h1 and I have paragraph, which are two different elements. Now, if I want to style both these components with similar styling, then I can use class name which is similar to both, and whenever the styles are written over this class name, that gets applied to both the elements, namely h1 and p. Say for example, class 1 heroes. Right? So id is basically used for distinguishing the components uniquely. Class name, on the other hand, you can consider it to be used for grouping a couple of elements which can later be used for applying a common styling. Okay, so on this line, let us now go ahead and see what are the different type of selectors. The first selector to name, ID selector. Second one, class selector. Third one, universal selector. And fourth one is your element or attribute selector. Okay, now let us see how these selectors can be used while implementation, right? So now coming to the first one, that is an ID selector. An ID selector is identified by a character that is prefixing the name of the ID which is given in your HTML document. What that character is? The character is a hash symbol. Okay, and similarly a class selector is identified using a dot. Universal selector is identified using an asterisk, and an element or an attribute selector is identified by the name of the element itself. Okay, it is identified by the name itself. Now how do we use them? We will see first theoretically, and then we will see through the implementation. Okay, now first, how do I define it or use the selectors in styling my web pages? Suppose I want to style a h1 element with the following properties: text to be in red color, right? Font family, I want it to be Cambria, right? And font size, I want it to be 40 px, right? These are some of the specification which I want to apply it on H1, right? So how do I do this? First, I will show demo. I will first write the code for internal CSS using ID selector. Okay, I hope you are able to follow till now. Let us now write the code here. HTML, we always have a head followed with title. You can write the title of your choice, right? Then style, because whenever you want to have an internal CSS, it has to be with the style element. Within this, now I said we are going to use the ID selector, right? So suppose ID selector is to be identified using a hash, right? So I say ID h. Okay, and then this is the syntax, general syntax, which you have already discussed for defining an internal CSS, which starts with an open brace and closes with an open brace. And we have to specify the properties here within this. So the properties that I want to set for the h1 element are the text color, which is supposed to be red in color. The next property is font size. I want it to be in 40 pixel. Then font family, right, to be of Cambria. Now I have defined a CSS which uses ID selector, right? How do I know it is an ID selector? It is, the selector is prefixed by a hash followed by a name here. Now observe, I am closing your style sheet now, style element now. Next, what am I going to do? I will close my head section because now I have to define the elements, which I am going to do that in the body section of the HTML document. What I'm going to have here, h1 element which I'm supposed to style, right? So h1, and I have already used an ID selector here. So now the attribute also I need to use an ID here. So ID, what name I'm supposed to give here? Name of the selector is h, right? And then close it off. Now give whatever message you want over which these stylings are to be applied. Say, I am going to write as hello listeners, like, and then close my h1. That's it, right? Now we will see using this code whether we are able to successfully apply the styling or no, right? So let me quickly open up my notepad, and whatever code is been written, I'm going to type it over here. HTML head. Then what do I have? I need to have my title. Say I will type it to be ID selector demo slash title. To close it, I need to style or write the internal CSS. So I use the internal yes, I use the syntax of defining an internal CSS which starts with an style element. And here I said we are going to use the ID selector defined using hash, the name being h, begin of defining internal CSS, color is going to be red, then font family, family is going to be Cambria, then font size is going to be 40 px. That is what was decided in the example. And now close the style element. Now define the document in body section where I am going to use h1 element defining with an id attribute as h, and then the content which I am willing to apply the internal CSS upon, that is hello listeners. Okay, slash h1. Then close your body element, close your HTML element. Save this as mm, selector underscore id dot html. Right? Now, to run this program, just go to the desktop. Going to the desktop. Um, yeah, open with Chrome. Yes, you are able to see hello listeners, right? The properties are set. The text is in red color, the font size is set, and the font family is also changed. Now, one thing you can observe here, if I write a second H1 element, right? Let's say hello world, right? What can you expect now? Will the styling be applied to this second H1 component? Yes or no? The answer is no, because the ID selectors work on the specific element only, because id selectors are used to identify uniquely the components, right? So if at all you want to apply the same styling here, right, what change I can do? So I can do the change here as, instead of an id, I use class, right? And what is the notation used to define a class selector? It is a dot. So now hash is replaced with a dot, and I can use the same name here. So before I could do that change, let us see quickly the execution of the same. No change here. That means the class selector is applied. Now if I want to apply it to the second one, what do I do? Class name equal to h. Now, both these H1 elements are having, let me make it H2, right? Both these headers are having same class names, right? And both of them should be applied with these properties. Will it apply? Let us check. Yes. But the difference is, this is in H1 and this is in H2. Right now, if you can observe it very clearly, if I take out this font size, right, now you can clearly observe the difference. This is in standard size of h1 and this is in standard size of h2 element. Okay, so the difference, if you could observe here, the class attribute, the class selectors are identified using dot. Now you can ask me, why are we using class selectors when it is same name? Why not id? It is a logical concept. Whenever ids are used, they have to have a unique value. So in order to hold that principle, we will not have two IDs with same values. So if at all you have such requirements where multiple components need to be applied with same styling, then you can go for using class selectors. And whenever you want unique identification of the elements for the associated styling, then go for id selectors. Similarly, right, you have universal selectors. What do you mean by universal selector? It is a selector which whose styling is applied to all the elements that are present in a web page. And this universal selector is identified using asterisk symbol. right? So now whenever I do this, I need not have any of the attributes specified to my specified within my elements, right? These are just the different ways using which you can perform styling, right? So let me just slightly change this so that you can observe the difference between previous and the current execution. You could see here now, wherever a uniformity of styling is required, you can go for using universal selector. How universal selectors are defined? They are defined using asterisk, right? And this style gets applied to all the elements that are present in your web document, right? Similarly, you the last kind of selector is an element selector, wherein the selector will hold the name of the HTML element only, right? Now I have replaced an asterisk with h1. If you observe, right, what does this indicate? It indicates a selector. And what type of selector it is? It is a element selector. Why? Because the name of the element is used in place of selector here without any prefix. This would be the syntax of an element selector. What is the syntax here? It just uses the name of the element whose styling is to be defined, right? So now see here, only h1 I have used. So what will happen? These styling will get applied only to the h1 element and not to h2, right? Let us save this and observe it for us. If you observe here, both the headings are in blue color. Now when I execute this, only h1 should have the blue color and the h2 should be going back to the default because no styling is applied on it. So when I execute, yes, that rightly happens. Now, for designing, you have these different type of selectors. As and when required, you can use a combination of these selectors in your program and complete your designing. Okay. So for example, let me just nest all of those into a single program here, right? Let me just say, okay, let h1 be of this. Let me have h2 defined with uh, the id. Okay, let me just make it h2, right? So I have to use id equal to h2, right? So now define its properties. What do I want? Color to be in red. Just for the simplicity, I'm using only one attribute set for h2, right? Similarly, for uh, the universal selector, right? I say text align is center. Whatever alignment we are doing, it has to go for center, and this universal property will be applied to all h1, h2 and the body component, right? Similarly, let me demonstrate a class attribute also for the paragraph element. Class equal to p1. This is beautiful. So now to style this paragraph, I need to use the class element. How do I use a class element? It starts with a dot and name of the class used. What is the name of the class used here? P1, right? So now define it. What am I going to define here? Say font size to be 100 px, just to make sure that it is bigger than h1. Okay, fine. That's it. So if you can observe here, we have used all the four type of selectors: a universal selector, element selector, ID selector and a class selector, right? So under whichever selector the properties are defined, those properties should get applied to all these components which are defined within your HTML documents. Let me save this quickly, get back here and execute. You can see here all the properties that were defined under element selector are applied. The ones using the ID selectors are applied. The one using the class selector for the size is applied. And the universal selector, that is all the content of all the elements to be center aligned, is also applied. So this is how you can use selectors for designing more efficiently and effectively your CSS. The same coding can be applied for designing external CSS. What is the change you are going to do? The style, within this style element, whatever is been written, you have to write the same thing in the separate file and save it as a .css file, and then link or associate your HTML document and CSS document for the style to get applied on your HTML document. Okay, so I hope the selectors are clear to you all. For further queries, you can please leave in your queries in the comment. Thank you.